they are. So as we now run through the story, there's just one other thing that is really worth clarifying is the phrase I put here, are they coming or are they going? So if I explain why, if you're trying to resolve the four Gospels, you may well find a situation like this. So I've got the same verse given to us in two different translations. So here's Matthew 28 verse 1. So as it began to dawn on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came to see the tomb. So that's the World English version. It's similar if you use the King James version. It's they came to see the tomb. Whereas the New English version, so World English version came, the New English version changes it and says they went to see the tomb. And you can see how when you're trying to resolve them, that issue is quite a headache. So, for instance, if they come to the tomb in its daylight in one gospel, then that's a problem. If they went to the tomb and it's hang on, which way around? If they came to the tomb and it's dark in one gospel, and then you read in another gospel that they went to the tomb while it was light. And it's not massively complicated, but it is very confusing because the translators of our Bibles haven't tried to translate them and taking any kind of sense of harmony into consideration. The actual solution is, of course, that the Greek word can mean either to come or go, depending on context. And when you're kind of resolving the Gospels, which one it is, you have to then look at the other Gospels and you have to try and work out in relation to that whether someone is coming or going. So I've marked where the word is used and I've translated it in a way that is consistent so that the coming and the going all make sense. But that won't always be the case with your regular English translations. So this is one of the benefits of the integrated text we've been trying to do. So I've got my little timeline on there. So we're going to start the day. I said just before dawn. It could be much before dawn, to be honest, because we're told it's while they're still dark. The whole thing starts while it's still dark. But we'll call it just before dawn. So it's Sunday. It's the 5th of April, 33 AD. Things are going to get frenetic, so we'll follow them carefully. You'll see the little clock in the corner. The clock is, of course, in no sense biblical gospel. It's just me trying to move the timeline forwards. So we start with Matthew's perspective. So Matthew is one of the 8 who's probably at Bethany. So it makes sense for him to start his story from the perspective of Bethany. And so he's going to record that the two Marys set out before the dawn to visit the tomb. So Mary's husband Clopas must be with them, but Matthew, because it's probably still dark. But Matthew doesn't actually, he omits telling us that because he doesn't want to confuse us. He doesn't focus or touch on Clopas. Clopas is referred to in Mark's Gospel and Luke's Gospel, but not Matthew's. Matthew just simply leaves him out for simplicity's sake. So he mentions the two women, but probably Clopas is travelling with them. But he's not actually going to the tomb because that's women's work. He's going to go back to the family and to the place where Mary is, who's gone to John's house. You remember we saw that Clopas is Joseph's uncle. And so he has a duty of care after his brother has died. Joseph has died to Joseph's wife Mary, who's now at John's house. So he's on his way to John's house and he's leaving the women. They will go on to the tomb. So he mentions that the two Marys set out and go with Clopas. So now after the Sabbath was passed, is the text blending Matthew and Mark together. So as the Sabbath was passed, towards dawn on the first day of the week, in other words, we are approaching dawn. Dawn hasn't happened yet. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to see the tomb rather than came to the tomb. If they came to the tomb, you see, it changed the order very much. But if they went to the tomb, they're going in the dark. So off they go. Meanwhile, and that little ripply effect was to tell you there's an earthquake. So it's still around 5. See, there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord descended from the sky and came and rolled away the stone from the door, and he sat on it. His appearance was like lightning. His clothing was white as snow. For fear of him, the guards shook and became like dead men. So here you go. I've animated the whole thing. Look at that. And off they go. They all kind of collapse in whatever. So we hear about one angel there. A second angel seems to appear. that's fine. Sometimes it's one of them who does the talking gets reported on. Sometimes we hear about the two. Sometimes there's the one. There's obviously that means when you're trying to put it together, there are two. Just occasionally we're only talking about one of them doing the talking, etc. So a second angel appears, and this is all going on around the tomb. So the party from Bethany, meanwhile, arriving at John's family house. It's about 2 miles, I think we said, didn't we, from Bethany? It's just over 2 miles actually, but so maybe I've got my timings wrong as to how long it would take. That would be one of the nice things where I'm as I say, I'm hoping to do a research trip with a colleague later this year back to Jerusalem. I've never been to Israel before. This is one of the things I want to do, is kind of actually try walking some of these things, just get kind of a rough idea of how long they take. But the party, that little party of the three of them who set out before the dawn from Bethany, they arrive then at John's family house where Salome is, because as John's mother. So they're there, and actually when they get there they find that Peter's found his way over here too, after the previous evening. So there's some connection now between Peter and John, but of course neither Peter nor John will go to tend the body, because that is, as we've touched on before, that's in gender roles, that was the women's role. So here's Peter. So Clopas is going to stay there, but Salome now joins the other two, and so she joins the party with the spices that she bought on behalf of all three women the night before at the market, which we read about. So Mark, who's of course sources Peter, so Peter is there in the house at the moment, and actually we are told by the early church that Mark's gospel was effectively him writing down the accounts that that Peter told in Rome, as he was telling the stories of the gospel. And so probably when Peter is telling the story, he's telling it from his perspective. This is the house he's telling the resurrection morning from. So Peter has always included Salome. There's not just Mary and Mary, as we had in Matthew's gospel. We now have Mary, Mary and Salome. So the two Marys and Salome set out for the tomb, but they're going to go via the Hasmonean Palace, because of course there are two other women at least there, or based there, or located. That's going to be their point of connection, to pick up Joanna and Susanna. Now, at this point, we're going to make an assumption that Mary Magdalene, in her kind of, if you like, her passion, because there is no doubt, as you read the kind of gospel narratives, that there is a kind of a deep kind of a commitment to Jesus in Mary's activities and life and so on. And so it seems that to go via the Hasmonean Palace means to kind of take a little bit of a dogleg, whereas actually there's a much more direct route from the lower city in the valley straight up to where the tomb is. So Mary goes kind of directly. They set off together, but she just heads straight up through the Ganath Gate, as it's called, up near the north part there. Whereas Salome and the other Mary are going in a slight dogleg fashion, because they're going to pick up Joanna and Susanna. We're actually going to read, Mary's going to arrive while it's still dark. The other women will be after dawn. So it's getting very close to dawn at this stage. So now Mary Magdalene came or went early while it was still dark to the tomb and saw the stone taken away from the tomb. So you can imagine just in the twilight, as we're kind of hitting that moment, if she goes or she leaves while it's still dark and she's getting there in the twilight, what's going on. So, but Luke, on the other hand, is telling, remember, Luke actually presents Joanna as being one of his key eyewitnesses. In the way he's structured his narrative, he presents her with what they call the eyewitness inclusio. He puts her at the beginning when she first comes into the story, the same with Mary, actually, Mary and Joanna. And then he names them right at the end as well here, in these incidents, to show that they were here. They were eyewitnesses from this point to this point. That's the style. So we know that some of his key eyewitnesses are there. So he's going to include them at this point. So he starts the narrative from when there's the group that's all together: Mary, Salome, and Joanna, and another woman from Galilee who we're assuming is Susanna because he's named her before. So they went with other women early in the morning. That's Luke 24. So here we go. So early dawn, they, the Galilean women, i.e. Joanna and Susanna, and some others, Mrs. Clopas and Salome, went to the tomb bringing the spices that they had prepared. Okay, a tiny little throwaway comment here. Luke refers to the spices which they prepared rather than the spices they bought. That is because the women in the Hasmonean palace wouldn't have to go to the market; they would just have those spices available there in the palace. So prepared is more relevant. They all had to be prepared, but only some of the spices had to be bought. So putting everything together, if we put those two accounts together, we get a kind of a bit of a story like this, So now early on the first day of the week, that's from Mark, Mary Magdalene came or went early while it was still dark to the tomb. She saw the stone taken away from the tomb. So therefore she ran and came to Simon Peter. Okay, so before the other women have even arrived, Mary has seen something. She has never gone into the tomb. She didn't remember. She sat opposite the tomb, looking from a distance. It was Joanna who was probably closer and actually saw not just where the tomb was, but how the body was laid in it. She was close enough in that way. As she's approached from a distance, seen the stone rolled away, in a kind of a place of panic, not knowing what's gone on, she's turned around and retraced her steps back to where Simon Peter is and John is, and to the other disciple whom Jesus loved. They're there at the same place, and says they've taken away the Lord out of the tomb, and we, she says, we don't know where they have laid him. John doesn't tell us about the other women. He only tells us about Mary. That doesn't mean he doesn't know about other women. But in this, so he actually includes in her testimony the fact that there were others there. We don't know where he is. What she really means is I don't, but we set out as a group. We left this house earlier today, or earlier in the morning, with Salome and Mary and me. The three of us set out. I'm running back now. I'm talking on behalf of the group, even though it's only me that's got there, as far as I know at this stage. Whereas now blending that with Luke's account, at early dawn, the Galilean woman and some others, Clopas and Salome, they went to the tomb bringing spices as they prepared them. As they came to the tomb, the sun had risen. So they've got there just after. So Mary has got there while it's still semi-dark. The other women have now arrived, but it's after dawn. But when they get there, of course, Mary's not there because she's turned around and run back. So there we go, having a little bit of movement from the ladies at the top, and Mary moving back down to where John and Peter are. So I'm just kind of making it logical and obvious. Let's just put this here. So while Mary set out with the others, she's taken that direct route. Salome and the other Mary pick up Joanna and Susanna. Mary sees the open tomb in the half-light, runs back through the Ganath gate, missing the other ladies who are coming via the Ephraim gate, which is more logical from the Hasmonean palace, where they would have been based, as we've looked at the story. So in actual fact, they don't cross paths. They're going in slightly different routes. One's coming in slightly from the side rather than straight up and down. So, so of course, Joanna and Susanna have been in the tomb already, so they get there and see the same open tomb, but they're not as nervous about entering it. So once they've kind of appraised that it's open, there are no guards, they hadn't really thought these things through, but they can see the situation, they decide to go and look in. They've already seen how the body is laid. They will have a much better idea of what's gone on and happened. So on entering the tomb, they actually encounter two angels, one of whom does the talking. So we kind of put the events together. Meanwhile, I'm going to come back and look at what the angel says. Meanwhile, Mary Magdalene's reached Peter and John at John's house, so she cries out, "They've taken the Lord out of the tomb. We don't know where they have laid him." Whereas back at the tomb, the angels say, "Go quickly and tell his disciples and Peter he has risen from the dead." So they actually instruct the women to go and tell his disciples. Well, where are his disciples? They're over in Bethany. And Peter, well, okay, Salome knows where Peter is because she left the house. He was there at the time, that he's risen from the dead. So they've got a task of folks to go and see. They've been commissioned with something. So we put it all together. It's the integrated text. So the women remembered his words. They went out, what the angel said. Do you know, I think I've neglected. Do you know what? Sorry. I have actually written out an integrated version of what the angel said, but for some reason I've not included it here. So, well, I think it's in your notes, so you have it in your in the sheets of paper that were sent to you if you registered for these events. So you can see how the three Gospels all fit together to tell the single story of what the angels said. But they remembered his words, i.e. the angels, and they went out and departed or returned quickly and fled the tomb with fear and great joy, for trembling and astonishment had come on them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Now, of course, we've got to qualify that. Some people make a big thing about that because, of course, they do go and tell people. We find several people they talk to. I think in its context, what it means is they've been told by angels to go and actually, I'm really annoyed I haven't got the integrated text. The angels have said he's going to meet you all in Galilee. But they're nervous, and so although they've seen people, and although as the execution of Jesus has permeated the kind of culture now, and people are aware of it, they don't say anything to the general public as they ran to bring his disciples the word, and then of course they told these things to the 11 and to all the rest. So they obviously do tell the people it's relevant for. All it's saying is they're not talking to people as they go. They don't go out shouting, "He's risen, he's risen." At this stage to all and sundry. Now, meanwhile, of course, Peter and John have heard that something has happened at the tomb. They don't know what yet. So they go running up there to the tomb via the Ganath gate, the same one that Mary has used, which means, let's assume that the women have kind of gone back the way they've come. It means that they will miss them as they leave the tomb at this stage. And so they're returning via the Ephraim gate. Mary Magdalene is following behind. We find she eventually comes into the narrative, but Peter and John get to the tomb quicker than she does. So we look at the text. So therefore Peter and the other disciple got up, went out, and they went or ran towards the tomb. So they both ran together. The other disciple outran Peter. So it's John's gospel, so he can kind of point out that he can run faster than Peter if he likes. And they came to the tomb. So first, stooping and looking in, that's Peter. That's John, saw the linen clothes lying, yet he didn't enter in. So they both ran up there. John's the faster runner. He's younger than Peter. They get there. He looks in, but leaves it there. Peter then turns up. Simon Peter came following him. And Peter, in type, in his personality, from a very red-hatted Barry, as I'm sure you'd agree, he learns by experience. He throws himself in the water later on as well. He goes straight into the tomb, and he sees the strips of linen cloth lying by themselves, the cloth that had been on his head, not lying with the linen cloths that had been rolled up in place by itself. So then the other disciple who'd come first to the tomb, he also entered. So John is a bit more cautious, appraising the situation, and he saw and he believed, for as of yet they didn't know the scripture that he must rise from the dead. So the disciples went away to their own homes, wondering what had happened. So you can see the confusion side going on. So, as I say, Peter and John, I do my little summaries this way. They've met up with Mary as she arrives. As they head back, they're obviously going to meet Mary, who's been following them up. But remember, at this point, none of these guys have met an angel, so all they know is that the tomb is empty. And Mary hasn't had time to kind of properly take it all in because she ran straight away. So it seems that she passes on through Peter and John as they're heading back through and goes up to the tomb to take some time there. Meanwhile, the other women who've kind of come via the other route are now looking for Peter, because after all, the angel said to them, which is why I'm annoyed that I didn't put their words into the PowerPoint presentation. They've actually explicitly said, go and tell his disciples and Peter, and they've forgotten that they've not actually done that. They've not found Peter yet, so they've gone looking for him. So they get down there, they find Clopas and Simon, whether they're at John's house as well or whether they're just with the relatives, but they've connected there. And they head off at this point to find the other disciples. So they're really all their actions are precisely in line with the words from the which they were asked to do by the angel who said, "You're going to go and meet him in Galilee. He's going to see you all in Galilee, but you've got to go and tell his disciples and tell Peter." So here they are at Peter's. So they will, they head on to John's house looking for Peter. He's not there. Clopas and Simon, having been told by them, Clopas and Simon decide to head north. So we don't know why, but we do know, as I say, that Clopas and Simon, the two that are going to be on the road to Emmaus, are part of Jesus' family. So although the angels haven't explicitly said, "Go and also tell his family," you can see why it's important to them. And the angels have said, "Go to Galilee." It's very likely, it's quite possible, that actually that Jesus' family are already heading north at this stage. They've gone through the trauma of seeing their relative crucified and executed. Mary, Jesus' mother, is absent from the story, but it's quite possible that the family has started to head north back. They're avoiding the main pilgrim route, which goes up via the Jordan Valley, because actually there's a much more direct route, which is normally excluded, and everybody in the pilgrim route will be all celebratory, and that they probably don't feel like that. So I think it's quite likely that in setting out for Emmaus, they're taking the less popular but more direct route to get back up to Galilee and to Nazareth, perhaps to reconnect and tell the family what's been told to the women. So I say they're presumably tracking down the other acquaintances, which we saw referred to being there at the cross. They're not the disciples, not the apostles, but there were other acquaintances in Jesus' family. They may have headed directly back to Galilee. So that's probably why they're going. So here we go. So now Peter and John get back to John's house, but by the time they get back there, of course, the women aren't there anymore because they found that no one's around. They start heading off to tell the disciples. So they're heading east. Simon and Clopas are heading up north. So the women head east, to the rest of the disciples. Peter and John arrive back at John's home. Mary, who's not yet taken time at the tomb, remains there to grieve. So while she's there, Mary decides to enter the tomb. Hopefully, as I say, if you're following along with the text, you see what I'm doing is I'm telling a story which has a lot in it that isn't in the Bible, but what we're doing is we are inferring or supplying things that something like them must have happened to make the story work, to give us the accounts that we've got, if that makes sense. Some people find it frustrating because most people have not tried to fit the pieces all together. But it's useful to do because actually there are people who try to fit the pieces together. When they fail to do it, they say they're impossible to fit together. What I'm hoping you can see by following through with the text and kind of telling the story is it's totally consistent with the people involved to end up with the testimonies as we have them, the four accounts. So Mary enters the tomb at this stage. She looks in. Here we go, coming at it from another angle. She enters the tomb. She sees two angels as well. Now, when Peter had risen early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, to whom he had cast out 7 demons. So first, Mary is standing outside the tomb weeping. So as she wept, she stooped and looked into the tomb and saw 2 angels in white sitting at the head and one at the feet where the body of Jesus had lain. And they told her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" And she said to them, "Because they've taken away my Lord, and I don't know where they've laid him." Mark's gospel tells us they're like men just dressed in linen, so she doesn't see them as particularly. She's not particularly astounded by them being angels. They're just people from her perspective. And now we're about to hit the first resurrection appearance. So she says that for whatever reason she leaves in her tears. It's frustrating. She's had none of the experiences that the other women have had at this stage. As she turns, goes outside, there's a figure that she can't quite see. When she'd said this, she turned around. She saw Jesus standing and didn't know that it was Jesus. And Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Who are you looking for?" And she supposed him to be the gardener. And so she said to him, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, that I may take him away." And Jesus said to her, "Mary." And she turned and said to him, "Rabboni," which is to say teacher. It's one of those wonderful little moments. There's wonderful human connections. And Jesus said to her, "Don't touch me, because I haven't yet ascended to my Father." A lot of people, I've often been asked about haven't ascended to my Father, because very shortly the other women in the group are going to see Jesus, and they're going to grab him and touch him all over the place. I think they don't hold on to me because I haven't yet ascended to my Father, but go to my brothers and tell them I'm ascending to my Father and to your Father and to my God and your God. I suspect it's much more just to do with where Mary's at and what she needs to do. Because in this little dialogue, Jesus is actually going to set up the figure of Mary quite stunningly for the early church. And personally, I believe this is why she's called Magdalene. What's going on? Sorry. You can see I'm being asked to add up stupid Microsoft. I've got to put my password in. So I think... Okay, see if I can just cancel it. Right, okay. Sorry about that little disturbance from Microsoft. So Jesus just kind of effectively is saying, okay, look, it's not about the reunion right now. There's something for you to do, and because actually she becomes known, of course, as the apostle to the apostles. She's the first apostle of the resurrection. All of these kinds of titles which Mary owns, which are very, very significant. And so it's kind of a very honouring kind of position here. And so it's important she gets this message, because from the point of his resurrection, she is the first person that Jesus commissions with a task, which makes her an apostle. Yeah. So the first thing Mary does is to return, because Jesus refers to Peter as well, to John's house. And passes the news on to John and Peter. So they all decide they've got to head to Bethany. But Peter is still coming to terms with his own denial of Jesus. And now there's a story that Mary is saying, I was at the tomb and I've actually encountered him. And so probably he wants to kind of rethink things through, really see, maybe he doesn't fully believe Mary. We're going to see the other apostles don't really believe the other women. But because he's gone through this big emotional experience, and here is Mary, who's just had this wonderfully kind of poignant reconnection with Jesus at an emotional level. So I'm going to suggest that they actually split up at this point. So Peter perhaps decides he wants to go back to the tomb, but John and Mary do as Jesus has asked them to do, which is to start heading out as well to Bethany, like the women have done already. So at this point, the other women are perhaps approaching Bethany. So we have them here, perhaps all just coming over the Mount of Olives, when we then have a second resurrection appearance. So as they went, this is now the group of women, to tell his disciples, behold, Jesus met them, saying, rejoice. And they came and took hold of his feet and worshipped him, you see, so they're touching. And Jesus said to them, don't be afraid, go and tell my brothers that they should go to Galilee, and there you will see me. So Galilee is mentioned again. Meanwhile, the guards have gone and reported back to the priests, not to Pilate. If they had deserted their post as Roman soldiers, they would be executed. So they wouldn't have the opportunity of getting a kind of a let-off. But actually, they are just the temple guards. So while they were going, behold, some of the guards came into the city and told the chief priests all of what had happened. When they were assembled with the elders and they take counsel, they gave a large amount of silver to the soldiers, saying, say it was his disciples who came and stole the body at night while we were slept. And if this comes to the governor's ears, we'll persuade him and make you free of worry. Because remember, they had permission from the governor, so even though it was their guard, they had their own guard, he was doing a task which the governor had requested. So they took the money and did as they were told. And this saying was spread abroad among the Jews and continues to this day. So there's a third resurrection appearance, which we don't read in the Gospels, we read it in Corinthians. So he was raised on the third day according to Scriptures, and he appeared to Cephas and then the 12. This is 1 Corinthians. So before Jesus actually appears to the 12, because Paul isn't telling us about the women here, he's talking about the apostles. before he saw the 12, he met Peter. Now, Paul is not unique in that. We're going to see it's also in the Gospels that Peter sees Jesus first, but we don't have any details of it. It seems that Jesus kind of appears privately to Peter, so we don't have any record of the where or when. I'm assuming that because he's encountered the testimony of Mary along with John, that John has accompanied Mary to go to Bethany, and perhaps that's why I'm saying Peter's perhaps near the tomb again. So we don't know what was said. It's probably key to part of Peter's restoration. We have more of that in John's Gospel a bit later on. But given the flow of events and our knowledge, it may well have been, as I say, back at the tomb where this is happening. So while that's going on, the women are arriving in Bethany. Mary and John are kind of coming slightly later, slightly behind, but they're all together. Oops, hang on, let's go back here. I've just realised I'll put myself back in the picture. Okay, yeah. So and he appeared to Cephas. That's from 1 Corinthians. ... And then it says, and then the 12. So we haven't quite got to the and then the 12, which is later in the same verse in Corinthians. So we're going to insert the text here from Luke and John. So Mary Magdalene came and told the disciples that she had seen the Lord. You see, so she's getting there, and he had said these things to her. Now they were Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary, the mother of James and Joseph. This is now Luke speaking, who told these things to the apostles. You see, so they've all arrived. The women have arrived first, and then Mary has turned up, probably with John as well. So he's another of the apostles, and these words seem to be nonsense, and they didn't believe them. So, perhaps it was even true of Peter and John. They. Earlier on as well, it's in a kind of place of we've grown up in a culture that doesn't trust the testimony of the woman, and here we've got a group of women, but they're giving us a testimony that seems remarkable and doesn't make sense to us. So they arrive in Bethany. They tell the disciples they've seen Jesus, and he said to them to go to Galilee. Then Mary and John turn up, but the disciples aren't believing the women at all until some point later on. Peter arrives and tells them a similar story. I have met now the risen Jesus. But if we now shift our attention to Clopas and Simon, who are heading north back to Galilee via Emmaus, so that this is now the fourth resurrection appearance. So a stranger joins them on the road. After these things, he was revealed in another form to two of them as they walked on their way into the country. See, two of them were going that very day to a village named Emmaus, which was 60 stadia from Jerusalem, and they talked to each other about all of these things which had happened. It happened while they talked and questioned that Jesus himself came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. So something about this whole experience is a sort of supernatural blindness, just the way the human brain works. You can there's a type of brain damage that you can incur by banging or whatever, which means you can accurately understand a face, but you don't interpret it the right way. A similar kind of blindness we find in the Old Testament when it's Elisha who's the king sends his troops to kind of go and find Elisha, and they actually see Elisha, but it says they were blinded. But it doesn't mean that they couldn't see anything, because they obviously can see a person, because he talks to them and says, "I'll show you where he is," and they follow him. So it's not a complicated thing to kind of understand. We kind of get it from a scientific point of view. There's a famous psychology book called "The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat." The difference between what you see clearly with your eyes and how you interpret it and understand it and recognize it is a mental process. So something kind of seems to be disturbing them in those ways. For whatever reason, it allows Jesus actually to give them some quite core teaching, because it talks about how he shows them all of the things in the Bible about him and so on as they're walking. So he says to them, "What are you talking about?" as they walk, and are you sad? And one of them named Cleopas or Clopas. One is the more Greek version of the same of the name. He answered them, "So are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who doesn't know what's happened here these days?" And he said to them, "What things?" And they said to him, "The things concerning Jesus of the Nazarene, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how the chief priests and our rulers delivered him up to be condemned." Hang on, I can move it there. See, and they crucified him, and we were hoping that he would be the one, that would redeem Israel. And it's a long passage. Besides all this, it's now the third day since these things happened, and now certain women of our company amazed us. Now, you see, this is interesting because, of course, remember, the women haven't been going around telling everybody. We're told they didn't speak to anybody except, of course, the disciples. But here, this is Jesus' family, as we know that testimony from the early church. So they are kind of part of the group that it's not public, general public. There's no contradiction. That there have been some scholars, you see, that say it's a contradiction. How would they know about, if they're just any old people, how would they know about it if the women didn't say anything? And, that kind of logic that is sometimes used. So when they didn't find his body, they came saying that they'd also seen a vision of angels and who said that he was alive. And some of us went to the tomb and found it like the women said, but they didn't see it. They didn't see him. So, okay, I've just spotted that. So probably there must have been some crossover with Peter and John as well. And he said to them, "Foolish men, you slow of heart to believe in all the prophets have spoken. Didn't the Christ have to suffer these things and to enter into his glory? Beginning from Moses, from all the prophets, he explained to them in all of the scriptures the things concerning himself." See, so he's taking this opportunity to now start to match what he has gone through, the events of the crucifixion, with texts from the Old Testament to show them those things. And as they drew near the village, they were going on. There, he acted like he was going further. They urged him, saying, "Stay with us. It's almost evening. The day is almost over." And he sat down, we know the story, he took the bread and gave thanks, breaking it, he gave to them, and their eyes were open. They recognized him, but then he vanished from their sight. And they said to one another, "Weren't our hearts burning within us while he spoke along the way and while he opened the scriptures to us?" So they run back to Jerusalem. And from there, they're going to go and search out the apostles because they just know they want to go back as well. That they have heard a testimony from the women that angels have said he was alive, and now they have had an experience and suddenly their eyes have been opened. So they're enthusiastic. They just run back. They're going to go through Jerusalem. Eventually, they're going to go on to Bethany to actually find the disciples. But initially, they're probably looking for Peter and John. So they probably go via Jerusalem. So they rose up and went that very hour and returned to Jerusalem. It's not in Jerusalem, and they found the 11 gathered together and those who were with them, and saying to the rest, that rest there is, of course, we certainly probably the women. We don't know what other of Jesus' wider discipleship network are now beginning to gather as well. Saying, "The Lord has risen indeed, and he's appeared to Simon," you see. So here we have in Luke's gospel a testimony that Jesus has now appeared to Simon. Although we've never read it in any of the synoptic gospels, we have a testimony to the fact it's happened at this point. So Paul is in alignment with Luke. So they related the things that had happened to them and how he was recognized by them at the breaking of the bread. And they, the rest, in this case, didn't believe them either. So there's apart from Peter, in other words. So the women have turned up saying it, they didn't believe them. Peter has turned up, they've kind of taken it a bit more seriously, but they still don't believe it. Now we've got two more who've saying the same thing. It's still a problem, and in the context of they didn't really believe it, we have the fifth resurrection experience or appearance. So he's telling the story when Jesus appears. I'm not going to read all of the text now, just to keep the story moving. Jesus suddenly is in their midst. He breathes over them prophetically. He was revealed to the 11 themselves as they sat at the table, and he rebuked them for their unbelief and hardness of heart, because they didn't believe those who had seen him after he had risen. So those being Mary, Peter, Clopas and Simon, who are part of his extended family. So when therefore it was evening on that day, the first day of the week, when the doors were locked and the disciples were assembled for fear of the Jews, as they said to these things, Jesus himself came and stood in the midst among them and said to them, "Peace be to you." They were terrified and they were filled with fear. And again, it's interesting to see we've blended Mark's gospel, Luke's gospel and John's gospel, and they all fit together. "Why do you doubt in your hearts? See my hands and my feet. It's truly me. Touch me and see. For a spirit doesn't have flesh and bones as you see that I have." And when he said this, he showed them his hands and his feet and his side. And while they still didn't believe for joy, he wondered, he said to them, "Do you have anything here to eat?" It's kind of, he's almost like proving to them. So he's asking them, to touch his physicality. So, "Have you got anything to eat?" They gave him a piece of broiled fish and some honeycomb, and he took them and ate them in front of them. And the disciples were glad when they saw the Lord. And he said to them, "This is what I told you while I was still with you. All those things that were written in the law of Moses, the prophets, the Psalms, concerning me must be fulfilled." So he's again, his second time, he's emphasizing there's something you can now see scripturally because of the events that have just gone through that you wouldn't have been able to see before. I've hinted at them before, but now I'm going to start being explicit about them and showing you those things. So he opened their minds that they might understand the scriptures. The scriptures here, of course, all being the Old Testament. We won't necessarily have to read all of it, but you can see it. You see, it was written, it was necessary for the Christ to suffer, to rise from the dead on the third day, and the repentance and remission of sins would be preached in his name to all the nations. So he's beginning to set them up for something that Jesus has obviously introduced his disciples to on a couple of occasions in his ministry on earth, when he commissions the 12 to go out and preach, and then he commissions the 72, and those two communities are going to become key in the next phase, which is the book of Acts. So they're going to preach to all of the nations, beginning at Jerusalem. You are witnesses of these things. I'm sending you forth the promise of the Father on you. Wait in the city of Jerusalem until you are clothed with power from on high. And there's a kind of a tension there, but that's fine. It's not a contradiction. It's just a tension, because the angels have said, and Jesus said, "Go to Galilee, because I'm going to meet you all there." But then he's talking about waiting in the city of Jerusalem. So you can see there's going to be a phase. They're going to go to Galilee, and then they're going to come back to be kind of what's the right word? To be faithful to the things that Jesus has spoken to them. But both things are in view. So Jesus said, "Peace to you, as the Father has sent me, even so I send you." And he breathed on them and said, "Receive the Holy Spirit." And I always take that as a really key moment. That there are kind of three words that are used through Scripture for the way the Spirit interacts with us. So the Spirit comes on people. He used to come on them in the Old Testament for the sake of doing something. It was kind of it was power for a commission. So the Spirit would come on Samson. He came on Saul, and Saul prophesies. There's a kind of an anointing to do something. So the Spirit comes on us, and the Spirit is with us. And Jesus says to his disciples in his ministry, he says, "You know the Spirit because he is with you." And then he says in John's Gospel, "But he will be in you." And that "in you" is the third element. And although we know about the day of Pentecost, and we always remember that, the day of Pentecost in many ways is the way the Holy Spirit came on people in the Old Testament. He comes on them with power for a commission. Whereas here, Jesus is breathing the Spirit into them, and that's often the quieter thing, but it's actually the real transaction in our faith. It's the Spirit coming alive in us rather than the power of the Spirit overwhelming us, coming on us. Just a little kind of touch on those things. If you think in Jesus' life, he was conceived of the Spirit. The Spirit was always in him, but in his baptism, the Spirit came on him to commission and release power. And we often make a thing of that because, in fact, because the Gospels do, that the Spirit hadn't yet been given because Jesus hadn't yet been glorified. So in other words, that there was something about the cross which was needed for us to receive the Spirit in a particular way. And I see this is the moment, it's the particular way in which the Spirit comes on the disciples. It comes into them rather than the on. So that's just on a personal level. I'm just kind of explaining how I see that passage. So he leads them out as far as Bethany, lift up his hands and bless them. So in other words, he leads them out. While he blessed them, he withdrew from them and was carried up into heaven. Now, this is not the ascension. That comes later. We know that those words are written by Luke, who wrote the book of Acts, and they were done as two halves of the same whole. So this is just in this kind of context, this key first meeting with the full group of the 11 surviving apostles and other disciples outside of Jerusalem. They've not yet gone to Galilee, where he's going to see more of them. But in this context, he's eaten with them, he's blessed them, he's breathed on them. There's something new in their spirits. But then he withdraws from them. But meanwhile, of course, I said the 11, it was only 10 because obviously Thomas wasn't there. So we know that Thomas isn't there. He eventually finds them. So they worshipped him. They returned to Jerusalem with great joy. So they've gone back now to Jerusalem. So rather than perhaps to Bethany. But Thomas, one of the 12, called Didymus, wasn't with them, and Jesus came, and the other disciples therefore said to him, "We've seen the Lord." But he said, "Unless I see his hand print in the nails and put my hand inside, I won't believe." And they were continuing in the temple, praising and blessing God. So remember, this is now the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So because Jesus has breathed on them and the Spirit's come into them, there's a new boldness in their spirit. They've been cowering out in Bethany, hiding from public. They're now coming in. They're just participating in the celebration and the feast. They're in the temple in Jerusalem. But after 8 days, again, the disciples are inside, and now Thomas is with them, and Jesus came, the doors being locked. Says, "Peace to you." So perhaps they're now in either John's house, the house where they had the Last Supper, maybe the family connections that Jesus had. We don't know. Maybe it's outside of Bethany right now, though. And of course, Jesus says, "Reach out your hand," and we know that story. And Thomas kind of now comes into that experience. So we're nearly at the end because I'm doing it at reasonable speed. This is going. Okay, yeah. Weirdly, I made them disappear instead of appear. They should have appeared. The Galilean encounters. I don't know what's going on there. Sorry about the slightly odd graphics. There are these Galilean encounters now. Oh look. Okay, so just so you know what should have happened, where I am at the moment. So if I turn myself off, if we go right back, I should have had those guys up there, but for some reason they're disappearing when I then put their words up. So that was an angel who, of course, said, "Tell his disciples he's risen. Behold, he goes before you to Galilee." So the angels have said that. Another angel, this is now in Mark's Gospel, "Go tell his disciples and Peter, he goes before you into Galilee." So he's going to Galilee. Jesus has also said, "Don't be afraid. Tell my brothers that they should go into Galilee, and there you'll see me." So there's been a regular kind of statement from both the angels and from Jesus that there's going to be something goes on in Galilee. So during the Feast of Unleavened Bread, they've stayed around in Jerusalem. They've been more bold. They've worshipped in the public there. But they know they're supposed to go to Galilee. And we're going to see there seems to be some instruction from Jesus because of references we get when they're in Galilee. There's been a little bit in terms, they're perhaps okay with the timing. They've waited around. It's allowed Thomas to reconnect with them during the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So now now when that's over and Jesus now kind of spoken to them, at some point they're going to head up, and we're going to read they're heading towards an appointed mountain, a mountain that Jesus has obviously therefore given them, and we're going to infer from that he probably also gave them some timing issues with that. So there's going to be a time and a place. So they go back to Galilee, but while they're waiting for that appointed time and place, let's just put me back there. Oh, I'm hiding. Well, we can always go to that view. There we go. You can see everything now. So the 11 disciples then proceed up to Galilee. That's Matthew 28. I think it's supposed to be verse 6, not 16. Anyway, I can't remember that. And of course, while they're waiting, Peter says, "Let's go fishing." And in that kind of context, in John's Gospel, after these things, the 11 disciples went into Galilee. It's what they've always been told to do. Jesus revealed himself again to the disciples at the Sea of Tiberias, which is the Lake of Galilee. It's named by the Romans Sea of Tiberias. He revealed them in this way. So Simon Peter, Thomas, Didymus, Nathanael of Cana of Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other disciples. So I've got them all there. You can see them all. Simon Peter says, "I'm going fishing," and they told him, "We're coming with you." And they immediately went out, got into the boats, but that night they caught nothing. And then when they see the character on the shore, Jesus calls out to them, "Come and eat breakfast," which I think is great. And then right at the very bottom, hang on, let's go back. No, okay, where? Yeah, there's that little the text is blocking it. This is the 3rd time now that Jesus was revealed to his disciples. So he's met other people, but this is the group together. So remember, they've been once together, but without Thomas. Then there was once with Thomas, and now there's another group of them again. So it's the 3rd kind of group appearance. But it's not the appointed time, because that goes on, if we read on in Matthew, to the mountain which Jesus had arranged. They've gone up to Galilee for a specific meeting, which has a place to it and a time. So presumably that time on the beach is because they got there early and they're thinking, what do we do for a few days while we wait for Jesus? And he's met with them that night. So this is the eighth resurrection appearance, and it says after that he appeared. This is Corinthians. If we fit it with Paul's testimony, this looks like it's the occasion when there are 500 people there. The majority of scholarship that takes the Bible seriously, because there's scholarship that doesn't, of course, would say this is the occasion. Matthew's Gospel only refers to the 11. But actually that doesn't mean to say the 500 aren't there. This seems to be the occasion. It's also where he commissions the disciples to take the gospel into all of the world. And it makes sense that if this is the occasion at the appointed place, and as we put these things together, because they have an unexpected meeting in Galilee, and yet they've been told to go to Galilee, there's probably an appointed time, that actually this is the point where they have reconnected with all of those who've been part of Jesus' discipleship programs over the previous 3 years, and brought them and maybe family members as well. So we hear, therefore, as Paul puts it, there are 500 who seem to be in one place together. And yet it's not a public place. The picture there is Mount Tabor, which is the Mount of the Transfiguration. It doesn't tell us what mountain, but it's a Galilean mountain. So I've kind of chosen it as the place we'll assume that at this place, which we read about at the end of Matthew, the final verses of Matthew, final chapter of Matthew, is probably the 500 that Paul is talking about. It's certainly the appointed place. There seems to be a time element to that. Therefore, the disciples have come back, spread the word around. People aren't sure whether they believe it or not. It actually says in the text that some believed and some doubted, or some they believed and they doubted. It's all there together. That makes more sense in the massive group. The 11 have now seen Jesus and are beginning to get certain in it. But this will be a shock for an awful lot of people as they see Jesus. But the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain which Jesus had arranged. You see, so he only refers to the 11, but that's why I say we put them together. And the majority of Bible believing scholarship tends to see this is the 500 time. So when they saw him, they bowed down to him, but some doubted. See, so wider group. Jesus came to them and spoke to them, saying, "All authority has been given to me on heaven and earth. Go into all of the world, preach the good news to the whole of creation. Make disciples of all the nations, baptize them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Teach them to observe all things that I commanded you." See, again, we've blended. We've got at least 2 Gospels in there. I've got a few lines which are just in the black, which come from Luke. And finally, as we're kind of putting the story together, which doesn't need so much integration. Of course, there are a few more experiences. So he then appeared to James. See, looks like Jesus, but slightly different clothes. And then to all the apostles. That's 1 Corinthians. We also know, of course, that Jesus then appears outside of Jerusalem for the Ascension in Acts 1. And then after his ascension, Jesus appears to Paul on the road to Damascus. Last of all, he appeared to me. So I think we're kind of coming now. Yeah, there we go, to the final slide. So let's go to, there we go, full screen. With me on it. As we put the story together. I will give an opportunity if anyone would like to comment in or ask anything. I actually, although tonight, in many ways, what we've just done is kind of, in one sense, told the story, and you think, oh, I know that story. But actually, hopefully, if you've put together there's been a lot of colour added. Because as we've tried to put the pieces together, we recognise that we need to add some of those extra experiences, those extra bits of colour. Not because we're adding to the Gospels, because it doesn't change the overall story, but in a way that actually makes you see that it's more than just a myth. There is a mythological element to it, in the sense that a myth talks about profound things that kind of get us to the psychological level. But it is more than that. It is also a real history, a real story. And actually that some of the things that actually look like they're confusing and people say, oh, well, it can't be true. Like the fact that the Last Supper is a Passover meal, but then Jesus gets crucified on the Passover. Well, those resolve as we start to put the complex history together. The way in which we understand the different locations and the fact that there are a couple of people called Mary in the mix. two possibly, and so on. The way in which the times seem to be slightly out of step because the different gospels are using different ways of referring to time during the day. As we put all of those things together, we actually can see there is a very real, logical, consistent story. It may not be 100% what actually happened, but it's a template by which we can say that what happened is not impossible from a kind of a harmonization point of view. And if one version is possible, then there will be other versions that are possible, which we may discover at some point. So my hope is, in that sense, while I can't present it to you and say this is 100% gospel truth, that actually I kind of feel quite confident in being able to tell that story and promote it because it makes sense of the text that we have. And if we find something that then contradicts it or whatever, I'm sure that will be able to be incorporated into a new version of that. So let me just kind of hand it over and see if anyone wants to ask anything or make any comments at this stage. So, and nice to see Carol. You must have joined us after we started. I didn't see you before. Anyone would like to say anything or ask anything?
How far was it from Galilee up to Jerusalem?
It's about. So I've done these things. The main pilgrim route is more like 5 days or so journey, but you can do it in about 3 if you head direct. So that probably means it's about 70 to 80 miles, but as the crow flies. And we know that certainly pastoral people can quite comfortably do 20 to 30 miles in a day. So I'm not saying you or I could do it in 3 days, Neil, but it is possible.
What about Emmaus? How far was that?
So it's about 7 miles. So 60 stadia is about 7 miles. It is not directly north; it heads west a bit. But I'm assuming that presumably, we don't fully know their motives, but presumably there's something to do with family or going back to Galilee that is prompting them to go the way they are. I've made that assumption that maybe they just want to avoid the pilgrim routes because at the moment they're a bit confused and so on. But why they stop in Emmaus? They've obviously got some sort of family connection there or something. But I wouldn't like to guess.
Yeah, and yeah. How far would it be from the tomb to John's house? Miles did Mary
yeah, so it looks to me to be about it's about 3/4 of a mile. I mean, it's a little bit because we're estimating where exactly in the so it could be as much as a mile, but 3/4 of a mile to a mile. So I think really kind of top to bottom the way and the wall there are people living beyond the wall to the north, which was then in later years by the end of the 1st century was incorporated into a bigger wall, but not such a high defensive wall, just a small wall. It's about 2 miles from top to bottom in Jerusalem. So yeah.
I've actually been to Jerusalem to that upper room.
Yes,
the upper room.
Yeah.
And also the Mount of Transfiguration.
Yeah, so Mount Tabor.
To get up the Mount of Transfiguration, a normal bus cannot get up there. You have to actually park at the bottom, and they bring a vehicle to take you up. Because it's so steep and twisty.
Yeah.
And that to walk from the Mount of Olives into the city centre itself is about a 2-hour walk.
Right. Yeah. Yep. So yeah, the Mount of Olives is right at the extreme of a Sabbath day journey from the edge of the city. So you can get to the foothills of the Mount of Olives, but not right to the top of it. So a couple of hours then, 2 to 3 hours to Bethany. Anyone else like to say or ask anything?
We obviously know the significance of Good Friday, Jesus' death, and the significance of Easter Sunday, the resurrection. What are your personal views on what happened on the middle day? Where was Jesus?
Yeah. Okay.
What was the significance of the Saturday, particularly?
So I've heard lots of views. There are various things that go back to early church writings. About descending, into Gehenna and preaching to the dead and all of these sorts of things. If any of that happened, I tend to think it's not the Saturday. I think that there's something theologically significant about the resting, the silence, the not doing anything. There's I know it sounds odd, but there's a bit in Revelation, in the kind of the culmination of the age where it says there's silence in heaven for half an hour, and of course the in creation God rests on the seventh day, and it's a day of nothingness. It's a day of kind of ceasing, and so I'm increasingly, as I've without being kind of dogmatic, increasingly I'm less convinced of Jesus doing lots on those days. Maybe they happen on the Friday if those things are important, that actually there is a genuine, if you like, stop, total rest, because we're going to restart, rather than kind of as my first ever paid work was on the theatre, Her Majesty's Theatre in the Haymarket. Where the interval, there's loads of frenetic work going on. I tend to now think there's something theologically significant in the idea of the rest and reset. But that's just that's my personal kind of reflection, not sound theology, as if. Thanks for the question though, Barry. So sorry I can't really give you a good answer.
I mean, what would have been happening with the Sanhedrin at the time? Surely they would have been trying to put a squash to all the things that have been happening.
So on the Saturday, as I say, they can't do too much because it is a Sabbath, but they've done enough. They've paid off they've convened and to try and pay, and said to the guards, we'll pay you. Don't say anything. We'll kind of cover that. That's the day. That's on the Monday. That's on the Sunday. On the Sabbath itself, they just kind of approached Pilate and asked him to send a guard, and he kind of, as I say, I think he kind of turns it around and says, well, you already got one, you sort it. So yeah. I think it takes a while before they start to realise the impact of what's happened. They try to anticipate it, but I don't think they take it as seriously as they don't realise the impact it's going to have.
And where would Herod have been at this time? I mean, because he was part of having.
Yes, I mean so Joanna and Susanna have left because they are part of his household. Or Joanna at least is, and we were assuming Susanna because she's named with there. So he will just be in Jerusalem for the feast period. It's invisible from their point of view. Of course, Jesus has been brought to him in many ways. We're told that Pilate and Herod have become friends over this period. So the fact that they're both involved in the trial, that they don't necessarily see. In the same way that even Jesus' disciples find it hard to believe what's happened, they wouldn't. I don't think it'll be impacted. It's only with what happens on the day of Pentecost and then the sudden explosion of the church that suddenly those stories need to kind of start coming together. But any other thoughts or questions, or clarifications?
I'd just like to say that this evening, for the first time ever, I've really understood quite how all those happenings around the tomb dovetail together, and that real sense of the humanity of them, sort of going about the tradition of taking the spices, but then the panic and the uncertainty and the confusion and people running one way and coming back in another way. Really helped me to sort of have a sense of just how it all dovetails together. But also that their humanity within it somehow. Just how they must have been, dealing with their confusions and running in different directions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, and the thing is, even on the paper map, that we put up, the distances don't look very far, but on a human level, when you actually, that half a mile distance, and it makes sense because, as I say, Joanna is the wife of Herod's finance minister. So, and this is where where all of his entourage are encamped for the feasts, and it is on a dogleg journey compared to, from where the tradesmen lived down the Tyropean Valley, where John would have had his house. So it makes sense. It's not just that's a convenient way of getting around the fact. It actually makes more sense of the geography of the city. So, but thank you for highlighting it.
Where they were located, would that not have been also affected at the time when Jesus was arrested, when they all scattered? They would have been in these different places. So
they were east of the city, because obviously, if we've done this in the previous weeks, Mike. When Jesus, the Gethsemane is is out towards the Mount of Olives, and in that that's the location where the soldiers have come, and they've actually, as we said, they would have scattered, eastwards towards Bethany, because actually the soldiers take Jesus westward into the city. The fort of Antonia, where they came from, is north, so they wouldn't go north, they wouldn't go west. That's why I said it seems that Thomas decides to run south because he isn't with them, but the rest of them head east and end up in Bethany, where they've been previously. So good. Well, it's 1 minute past 9, so we've pretty much done. We're on target tonight. So I'll just give an opportunity if anyone wants to make a last comment. Oh, and please, I'll make a last comment. So obviously these are taking place in my live events, but it's really helpful if you've got something worthwhile out of it. We keep doing these. If please make a gift. I won't put any more pressure or say anything more than that, but it does help. When I live sort of by teaching ministry, although now I'm also doing a little bit more organisational leadership at the church where Mike and Richard are part of. So, among others, I should say. Pardon?
It's an amazing piece of work that you've put together.
Well, it kind of grows each year, and there's stuff that I've now dropped out of it that I keep thinking we ought to put it back in, but it would take too long then. Neil. Yeah.
Really interesting.
Yeah.
And as Helen was saying, it does just make it become more human.
Yeah.
To see that. It actually makes sense that they were kind of going different routes and missing each other and stuff, because that's what happens in real life.
Yeah. No, and it to give context of my father published a solution on the movement of the women. I mean, it came out the same week that a little book on the movement of the resurrection morning was published by a guy called John Wenham, who I really like. He was the person who gave me the confidence to see the early origin of the Gospels. But you can't get his book anymore. In fact, you can't get my dad's book anymore. They're both impossible to get hold of. But just so although I've added lots of character details and so on over the time, the fundamental kind of movement solution came out in the same week, 2 publications with the same solution, but they weren't. My dad actually wrote to them, and there was a little note kind of put in that this is actually at the publishers when his book came out, at the time. So they were, which is not a competition thing. It's actually it's actually a kind of a confidence thing that 2 people have looked at it and come up with the same solution of how the movements have taken place. So good, brilliant. Well, thanks ever so much for your time, everyone. So as the year goes on, we'll do some other things which are less intense. This is the longest one, 6 weeks. So we'll be looking at things like the ministry of John the Baptist later in the year. I tend to focus these on kind of I'm focusing most of this year on teaching around the Gospels. So it's kind of the history and details of the characters and so on in it. But So if anyone's for one of those, it'd be lovely to see you again. We'll of course send emails out to let you know what's happening.
Great.
Brilliant. So okay, well, Father, thank you for our time, and bless everybody as we turn our attention towards those events of Easter when eternity happens in history. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. Well, bless you, everyone, and
Awesome. Thanks, Christian.
maybe see you at some point in the future.